The summer of 1781 had dragged on longer than I cared for, the air thick with the scent of sweat, gunpowder, and barely contained hope. I'm Jonathan Reed, a captain in the Continental Army, and for 6 years I'd marched through mud, dodged bullets, and watched friends fall, all for the dream of a free America. But here we were, outside the bustling port of New London, New York. Not exactly the glamorous setting for history to be made, but this was our reality. Our commander, General George Washington, looked every inch the worn leader that day. His broad-brimmed hat sat low over his eyes, and his coat, once crisp and new, was now streaked with dirt and battle scars. I swear, if Washington had a pair of boots any shinier, they'd have blinded the British just by walking into battle. Around camp, the men whispered about the odds stacked against us. The British, under the notorious General Charles Cornwallis, had us outnumbered and outgunned. Their red coats gleamed in the sunlight, and their cannons were poised like hungry beasts ready to tear us apart. We'd heard rumors of a French fleet led by Admiral Delacroix sailing into Chesapeake Bay, poised to tip the scales. It sounded like a fairy tale, French ships, American grit, and a daring plan to trap the British far from their stronghold. Washington's plan was audacious, a secret march with over 12,000 soldiers, winding nearly 700 miles south to the quiet town of Yorktown, Virginia. A small fishing village, hardly the battlefield of legends, but soon to be the stage of our destiny. I packed lightly, my musket, a worn leather satchel, and a keepsake from home, a simple silver locket my sister had pressed into my hand before I left. I figured if I was going to die, I'd at least look good doing it. The men joked about my sense of style, but I like to think my polished boots and neatly tied neckerchief lifted spirits when the world felt like it was falling apart. As we set off under the cover of dawn, the air buzzed with nervous energy. Private Henry, always the joker, grinned and whispered, "If we make it out of this, I'm opening the first pub in Yorktown. Drinks on me, lads." The march was brutal, sweltering heat, rough roads, and the constant threat of British patrols. But the thought of locking down Cornwallis' forces and ending this nightmare kept us moving forward. By the time we reached the outskirts of Yorktown, the mood had shifted. The French ships were anchored in the bay, their sails billowing like the wings of giant white birds. Our allies, led by the fiery Marquis de Lafayette, were already digging siege lines, their uniforms striking against the dusty earth. Lafayette himself wore a crimson sash that caught the sunlight, his dark hair tousled, but his eyes fiercely determined. I caught a glimpse of his smile. It was the kind that promised victory or a glorious death. We set to work, trenches cutting into the soil, artillery pieces rumbling into position. The British, trapped and desperate, had fortified the town with redoubts and earthworks, but we were hungry for more than just survival. The first shot rang out just as twilight settled, a cannonball smashing through a British officer's mess, sending their dinner flying. Someone joked that our aim was better than their cooking, and for a moment we all laughed amid the chaos. But beneath the banter was the grim reality. This battle would decide everything. As night fell, the musket fire was replaced by the steady thunder of our artillery, tearing into British defenses. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of men fighting for their futures. And just when I thought the worst was behind us, a messenger arrived with news that chilled my bones. General Cornwallis himself was planning a desperate breakout. The question was, would we be ready? The siege was far from over, and the fate of our fledgling nation hung in the balance. But I had a feeling, deep in my gut, that the story of Yorktown was just beginning, and the next chapter would be written in blood, fire, and maybe a little bit of luck. The dawn broke over Yorktown like a slow burn, casting a pale light on the battered earthworks and the tangled lines of trenches we'd spent endless hours digging. I wiped the sweat from my brow and looked around at the men beside me. A mix of Americans, French allies, and hardened veterans who had seen more than their fair share of war. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and gunpowder, but also something else. A tense quiet, like the calm before a storm you just know is coming. General Washington stood nearby, his figure stoic against the morning haze. His coat was dusted with dirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms scarred from years of battle. He didn't say much, but his eyes scanned the horizon, calculating, waiting. Beside him, the Marquis de Lafayette adjusted his crimson sash with a flick of his wrist. Even in the grim reality of war, the Marquis managed to look every bit the dashing nobleman, his dark curls falling just so, a silver medallion glinting at his throat. I swear the man could have walked straight into a ballroom and stolen the show, but instead, here he was, knee-deep in mud and bullets. Our French comrades, led by the enigmatic Commander Rochambeau, who looked like he stepped off a stage with his tailored blue coat and polished boots, were a sight to behold. They moved with a precision that was almost hypnotic, setting up cannons and signaling orders in a language that sounded like poetry to my ears. The British weren't idle either. From their redoubt we could see their sentries pacing like caged lions, rifles ready. General Cornwallis, the grizzled British commander, was a shadowy figure. Rumor had it he was a man who feared nothing, but lately his movements seemed more frantic, his orders desperate. That morning, as I checked my musket and tightened the strap on my leather cartridge box, a strange hush fell over the camp. Then, without warning, the sky erupted in thunder. Our artillery roared to life, cannons belching fire, sending iron storms crashing into British lines. The ground shook underfoot, and the air was filled with a deafening roar that drowned out even the sharp crack of musket fire. I was stationed near the main battery, alongside Corporal James, a lanky fellow with a grin that never quit, even when half his teeth were missing. "Well, Johnny," he shouted over the noise, "looks like we're giving those redcoats a proper headache." I couldn't help but smile, even as the smell of burning wood and flesh stung my nostrils. The bombardment was relentless. We kept the guns firing day and night, determined to wear down the enemy's defenses. At times the British would try to repair their battered fortifications under cover of darkness, but our sharpshooters made sure to remind them it wasn't so easy. Amid the chaos, I caught sight of a figure moving along the British lines. A German soldier, part of Cornwallis' Hessian mercenaries. His uniform was torn, face smeared with grime and sweat, eyes haunted. I overheard a French engineer whisper that the German had described the horrors they faced: exploding bombs tearing limbs apart, civilians fleeing with whatever they could carry, the once proud ships in the harbor reduced to splinters. It was a grim reminder that war was no game. As the day wore on, I found myself thinking about home, my family in that small village outside Boston, the quiet orchard where my sister would be picking apples. I wondered if I'd ever see it again, or if this siege would be my last stand. Night fell, but our guns didn't. Washington had ordered a constant barrage, denying the British any rest. The stars above seemed to flicker nervously, like witnesses to the carnage below. Then, just when exhaustion threatened to drag me under, word came that Cornwallis was planning a bold move, a surprise attack to spike our cannons and break the siege. The tension snapped tight, and I knew the real fight was about to begin. I gripped my musket tighter, heart pounding. War was a cruel dance, and Yorktown was the stage where fate would decide who led and who followed. But little did I know the night held secrets darker than the smoke-filled sky, and that the battle for freedom was far from over. The night air hung heavy with anticipation, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your pulse race like a wild horse. I sat by the flickering campfire, trying to steady my hands as the whispers of the coming British raid spread through the ranks like wildfire. The men around me, grimy, tired, but unbroken, sharpened bayonets and checked their powder pouches, each preparing for the nightmare that was about to unfold. I adjusted my jacket, the worn leather creaking softly, and glanced over at Abigail, the camp nurse. She was a sight in that dim light. Her deep emerald dress hugged her figure just enough to hint at grace beneath the grime, and the lace trimming around her sleeves fluttered as she moved swiftly between the wounded. Her auburn hair, usually tied back in a practical bun, had escaped loose tendrils that framed her face, softening the harsh lines of the war. Even in this hell, she carried an air of quiet strength that made the soldiers believe miracles were possible. "Jonathan," she said softly, handing me a bandage. "You'll need this tonight." I nodded, feeling a warmth beyond the fire's glow. "Thanks, Abigail. If I make it back, I'll owe you a proper drink." She smirked. "Make it back, then we'll talk." The hours before the attack crawled by, each minute stretching longer than the last. Then, like a storm breaking, the British struck. From the darkness, a wave of redcoats surged forward, led by Colonel Abernathy, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his flair for dramatic speeches. I heard his voice cut through the chaos. "Push on, lads. Tonight, we skin the beasts of rebellion." Axes swung, muskets cracked, and the air filled with the sickening thud of bodies colliding. The British targeted our artillery lines, determined to silence our guns by driving iron spikes into the touch holes. I fought side by side with Corporal James, who, despite the madness, kept cracking jokes. "I swear, Johnny, if this were a dance, it'd be the worst waltz ever." Our bayonets clashed with their swords in a brutal, intimate struggle, steel biting into flesh, men screaming and falling. The smell of gunpowder mingled with sweat and blood, a cocktail that burned my throat. Amid the melee, I caught sight of Abigail tending to a wounded soldier just beyond the front lines, her hands steady despite the screams around her. I wanted to shout a warning, but my voice was lost in the chaos. By dawn, the British had retreated, having spiked several cannons but failing to break our lines. The damage was quickly repaired, thanks to the tireless work of our engineers and an unspoken determination that no man could crush our spirit so easily. As the sun rose, casting a pale light over the battered battlefield, I took a moment to catch my breath. Nearby, Lafayette was rallying the troops, his voice ringing clear and commanding, despite the exhaustion etched on his handsome face. His coat was dust-streaked, and the crimson sash now smeared with dirt, but his eyes burned with unyielding fire. "Today we show them we are not just farmers and shopkeepers," he declared. "We are the storm that will sweep tyranny from this land." His words stirred something deep inside me, a mix of pride and fierce resolve. I glanced back toward the British redoubt, where Cornwall was likely nursing his wounds and plotting his next move. But then a messenger arrived with news that chilled the camp. Cornwall planned a desperate evacuation across the York River, hoping to escape the tightening noose and link up with reinforcements. It was a gamble that could change everything. We scrambled to prepare, knowing the coming hours would test every ounce of our courage and skill, and as night fell once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that Yorktown was about to erupt into a final brutal crescendo, one that would either seal our fate or shatter the chains of oppression forever. But fate, as always, had a few surprises left in store. The night was thick and heavy, like a wool blanket smothering the earth, when the first boats slipped quietly into the shadowed waters of the York River. I stood at the edge of the camp, muscles coiled tight, listening to the faint splash of oars cutting through the blackness. General Cornwall's desperate plan was unfolding, a midnight escape that could unravel everything we'd fought for. The British troops, clad in their iconic red coats that somehow seemed less bright under the moonless sky, shuffled silently onto the waiting boats. I could just make out the gleam of bayonets reflecting the dim starlight, like rows of deadly teeth ready to bite. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a bayonet, though I'd advise against that. Those things are sharp. Lafayette stood nearby, his usual fiery confidence tempered by the gravity of the moment. His deep blue coat was dusted with dirt, the gold buttons catching what little light there was. His dark curls clung damply to his forehead, but his eyes were fixed, burning with determination. "If they think they can slip away under our noses," he muttered, "they've got another thing coming." We'd positioned sharpshooters along the riverbank, muskets raised and ready. I gripped mine tightly, knuckles white beneath my gloves, heart hammering like a drumbeat in a war song. The plan was simple. Let the first wave cross, then strike hard and fast to cut off the rest. But as the boats returned to pick up more soldiers, the weather had other plans. A sudden squall whipped across the river, turning the calm waters into a churning nightmare. Waves rocked the boats violently, and the oars splashed furiously as men struggled to keep afloat. Shouts and curses echoed over the storm, mixing with the crack of musket fire. Corporal James, ever the optimist even in the worst of times, leaned over and grinned despite the chaos. "Well, Johnny, if this doesn't sink 'em, nothing will. Maybe the Almighty's got our back tonight." I couldn't argue with that. The storm made it impossible for Cornwall's remaining troops to make a second crossing. Stranded and trapped, their fate was sealed as our lines tightened around Yorktown like a noose. The next morning, the battered British fortifications looked like the aftermath of a tempest. Craters pocked the earth, wooden palisades splintered and blackened from relentless cannon fire. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the scent of gunpowder hanging like a grim fog. Washington rode along the lines, his face set in a grim mask of resolve. His once pristine uniform was now streaked with dirt, his boots caked in mud, but his presence inspired a quiet strength in every man who saw him. Nearby, Abigail moved among the wounded with practiced grace, her green dress stained but still elegant, the lace cuffs delicate against the grime of war. Her eyes met mine briefly, and in that glance I found a flicker of hope. Suddenly a bugle call pierced the morning air, the signal that the final assault was imminent. We gathered our weapons, fixed bayonets, and prepared to storm the British redoubts. The moment was electric, charged with the knowledge that this could be the end of the war, or the end of us. As we advanced, the enemy hurled grenades and musket fire, but we pressed on, men climbing over earthworks, bayonets flashing in the rising sun. The clash was brutal and unforgiving, steel meeting steel in a savage dance. Amid the chaos, I caught a glimpse of Cornwall himself, pale and tense, barking orders in a voice edged with desperation. His grand dreams of victory were crumbling before my eyes. When the smoke cleared, the British defenses lay shattered, their soldiers retreating into the town's heart. But just as victory seemed within our grasp, a messenger galloped up with news that made Washington's jaw tighten. General Clinton's relief force had arrived too late. The French fleet still commanded the bay, and the noose was tightening. The final act was at hand, yet beneath the triumph, a shadow lingered. Rumors whispered of a secret correspondence between Cornwall and an unknown figure, a betrayal that could unravel everything we'd fought for. As I stood amid the ruins of Yorktown, musket in hand and heart pounding, I knew the story was far from over. And somewhere in the smoke and silence, a darker game was being played, one that would test the very soul of this new nation. The morning sun burned through a brittle sky as we gathered our forces for what felt like the final push. The air was thick with tension, but also a strange electric hope, the kind that makes a man's skin prickle and his heart race. I tightened the straps of my leather cartridge box, adjusted the worn neckerchief around my collar, and glanced over at Abigail. She stood by the makeshift field hospital, her emerald dress smudged with dirt, but still catching the light just enough to remind me there was life beyond this war. Her hands moved swiftly, tending to the wounded with a calm that belied the chaos around her. I swear, even in the middle of hell, she had the grace of a queen. General Washington rode past, his gray eyes sharp beneath his weather-beaten tricorn hat. He looked every bit the leader who had carried us this far, worn, determined, but unyielding. Beside him, Lafayette's crimson sash was smeared with dust, but his smile was as fiery as ever when he caught my gaze. "Ready to finish this, Reed?" he called out, voice ringing with that unmistakable mix of charm and steel. "As ready as I'll ever be, Marquis," I replied, gripping my musket tighter. The plan was simple but brutal. Under cover of darkness, we'd silently approach the British redoubts with fixed bayonets, axes in hand, ready to hack through their wooden defenses. No gunfire until we were inside their lines. Stealth and steel would be our weapons. At 6:30 p.m., with the sky cloaked in near-total darkness, we began our advance. The only sounds were the soft crunch of boots on dirt and the whispered orders from our officers. I felt the weight of every eye watching, every breath held, as we neared the enemy's fortifications. Suddenly, the silence shattered as we crashed through the wooden palisades, axes biting into the barricades with fury. "Rush on, boys!" "The fort's ours!" someone shouted, the battle cry slicing through the night. The British fought hard, throwing hand grenades and swinging bayonets with desperate fury. Men climbed on each other's shoulders to scale walls, the night alive with the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. I fought like a man possessed, every swing of my musket butt and every thrust of my bayonet fueled by the hope of freedom. In the midst of the chaos, I caught a glimpse of Cornwall, pale and furious, barking orders to rally his men. But it was clear the tide had turned. The battle was a savage symphony of pain and courage, but by dawn, the British redoubts were ours. Yet, even in victory, the cost was clear. Friends lost, bodies strewn across the earth, and the weight of what freedom demanded pressing down on us all. That night, as I sat by the dying embers of our campfire, Abigail slipped beside me, her hand brushing against mine in a quiet gesture of comfort. "We're almost there, Jonathan," she whispered. I nodded, eyes fixed on the dark horizon where Yorktown's battered silhouette stood. "Almost," I said, "but the hardest part is yet to come." Unbeknownst to us, a shadow lurked in the British camp, a secret that would ripple through the coming days and threaten to unravel everything. A betrayal hidden beneath layers of smoke and blood. And as the first stars blinked into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this war for freedom was far from over. The morning after the assault dawned cold and gray, the kind of sky that presses down on your shoulders and makes every breath feel heavy. The battlefield was a grim patchwork of shattered earth, splintered wood, and the silent forms of men who'd paid the ultimate price. I moved through the camp with a mixture of exhaustion and grim satisfaction, my boots crunching over broken muskets and discarded bayonets. Abigail was already busy among the wounded, her emerald dress now stained with blood, her sleeves rolled up to reveal slender, determined arms. Her hair, once perfectly pinned, was loose and tangled, framing a face that bore both the softness of compassion and the hardness forged by this relentless war. I caught her eye for a brief moment, and she gave a tired, reassuring smile. "We'll make it through this," she said. Somehow I believed her. General Washington was holding a council with Lafayette and Rochambeau, the French commander, beneath a makeshift tent. Their faces were taut, voices low but urgent. I overheard fragments, talk of negotiations, surrender, terms, all words that felt like the final moves in a deadly chess game. Cornwallis was cornered, his defenses crumbled, his army starving and broken. The once mighty British general had refused to appear at the surrender ceremony, citing illness. Instead, he sent Brigadier General Charles O'Hara to negotiate on his behalf. a man whose polished uniform and carefully trimmed mustache stood in stark contrast to the ragged soldiers around us. As the sun dipped low, the air grew tense with anticipation. The British drummer appeared, solemn and steady, followed by O'Hara carrying a white handkerchief, the universal sign of surrender. I stood among the ranks, musket at my side, heart pounding in a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. O'Hara first offered his sword to Rochambeau, who shook his head and gestured toward Washington. The general, ever the statesman, declined as well, passing the honor to his second-in-command, Major General Benjamin Lincoln. It was a symbolic moment, heavy with the weight of history. As the British marched out of Yorktown on October 19th, their heads held high despite defeat. The sound of their band playing "The World Turned Upside Down" echoed through the crisp air. It was a bitter melody, but one that seemed fitting for the day. Lafayette, never one to let an insult go unanswered, snapped his fingers, and his band struck up "Yankee Doodle Dandy." Cheers erupted from both American and French lines, a triumphant roar that shook the ground beneath us. In that moment, the British finally turned to face us, no longer as tyrants, but as worthy adversaries. The war was over, at least for now. But as the dust settled and the victors tended their wounds, whispers began to spread, rumors of secret letters, hidden agendas, and betrayals that reached far beyond the battlefield. Was Cornwallis the only one playing a shadowy game? Or was there a deeper conspiracy threatening the fragile peace we'd won? As I looked out across the fields of Yorktown, the setting sun casting long shadows over the fallen, I realized that the true battle, the fight for the soul of this new nation, was only just beginning. The crisp autumn air carried a strange stillness over Yorktown in the days following the British surrender, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I found myself wandering through the makeshift camp, the weight of victory settling like a fog over the men. Faces once filled with fire now bore exhaustion and uncertainty. Freedom was won, yes. But at what cost? Abigail moved among us like a quiet guardian angel, her emerald dress now faded and worn, the delicate lace at her cuffs torn in places, but still clinging to the hope she carried within. Her eyes, sharp and searching, seemed to see beyond the surface, as if she sensed the uneasy calm before the storm. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat beside the riverbank, watching the water ripple under a fading sky. Lafayette joined me, his crimson sash loosened, the dust of battle still clinging to his coat. His usually confident smile was replaced by a furrowed brow. "Jonathan," he began, voice low, "there are whispers, secrets buried deeper than the trenches we fought in." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of secrets?" He glanced around, then leaned in. "Letters intercepted, coded messages between British officers and unknown parties. Some say Cornwallis was but a pawn in a larger game, one that could unravel all we've achieved." I felt a chill despite the fading warmth of the day. "A spy, then? Or worse?" Lafayette nodded grimly. "Perhaps. Our victory may have sown the seeds for new battles, ones fought not with muskets but with whispers and shadows." Just then, a commotion stirred near the camp entrance. A courier galloped in, dust trailing behind his horse. He handed Lafayette a sealed envelope, its wax crest broken and hurriedly resealed. Lafayette broke the seal with trembling fingers and read aloud, "A meeting is to be held at midnight at the old lighthouse on Gloucester Point. Matters of national importance. Your presence is requested." My heart thudded. Gloucester Point was just across the York River, and the lighthouse stood as a lonely sentinel over the water, a perfect place for conspiracies to unfold under the cloak of darkness. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that the war's end was merely the prologue to a darker tale. As the camp settled into uneasy silence, I prepared myself for a journey into the unknown. Abigail caught me as I gathered my gear, her eyes fierce despite the shadows under them. "Be careful, Jonathan. Sometimes the greatest dangers don't come from the enemy in front of us, but the ones hiding in plain sight." I nodded, the weight of her words settling deep. The battle for independence had been won, but the fight for truth and survival was just beginning. Under a moonless sky, I set out toward Gloucester Point, the river's cold breath whispering secrets as I crossed into the night. The path to the old lighthouse at Gloucester Point was cloaked in shadows, the only light coming from the distant flicker of a lantern swaying in the night breeze. The river's restless waves murmured secrets against the shore as I approached, every step measured, every sound amplified in the eerie quiet. The air smelled of salt and something else, something like danger. The lighthouse itself was a stoic figure against the dark sky, its whitewashed walls chipped and weathered by years of storms. The faint glow from within hinted at life, but no friendly welcome awaited. I tightened my coat against the chill and slipped inside through the creaking door. Inside, the narrow spiral staircase wound upward, each step groaning underfoot. At the top, a group of figures huddled in whispered conference. Familiar faces emerged as my eyes adjusted, the Marquis de Lafayette, Commander Rochambeau, and a few others whose loyalty to the cause was unquestioned. But amid them stood a stranger, a man in a tailored navy coat embroidered with gold trim, his expression unreadable beneath a powdered wig. Lafayette's voice cut through the murmurs. "Gentlemen and Jonathan," he nodded in my direction. "Thank you for coming. The situation is graver than we feared." The stranger stepped forward, his voice smooth but steely. "I am Captain William Hargrave of His Majesty's Intelligence Service. I come not as an enemy, but as a man who sees the futility of continued bloodshed." I narrowed my eyes. "And why should we trust a British spy?" Hargrave smiled thinly. "Because I bring news of a conspiracy that threatens us all. There are factions within the Crown eager to continue this war for their own gain. Profiteers, power brokers who prefer chaos to peace." Rochambeau frowned. "And what do you propose?" Hargrave produced a folded document, its edges worn. Evidence of secret communications between these factions and certain American sympathizers who seek to undermine the fragile peace. If left unchecked, this could ignite a new conflict, one that would drown both our peoples in blood. Lafayette's eyes flickered with disbelief. "You expect us to believe this?" "Believe what you will," Hargrave replied, "but I offer my assistance to root out these traitors. I stand to gain nothing but peace." The room fell into tense silence. I glanced at Abigail's warning from earlier, the greatest dangers hidden in plain sight. Could this man be genuine or a wolf in sheep's clothing? Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from below. A messenger burst in, breathless. "Sir, a coded dispatch was intercepted from New York. Plans for a clandestine meeting between British loyalists and an unidentified American faction. Tonight." Lafayette's jaw clenched. "Then we have no time to lose." Hargrave nodded. "Agreed. We must act swiftly, or all we fought for will be lost." As we prepared to leave the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was shifting, from muskets and cannons to secrets and shadows. And somewhere in the darkness, enemies both known and unknown were closing in. The war for independence had changed, and so had its warriors. Under the cloak of night, we slipped silently from the lighthouse, the weight of Hargrave's revelation settling heavily on my shoulders. The moonless sky seemed darker than ever, as if the stars themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next move in this deadly game. Lafayette, Rochambeau, Hargrave, and I moved swiftly toward the rendezvous point, a secluded tavern on the outskirts of New London, where loyalists and shadowy figures were rumored to gather under the guise of harmless revelry. The streets were deserted, cobblestones slick with recent rain, and the faint glow of lanterns flickered behind shuttered windows. Abigail's warning echoed in my mind. The greatest dangers hide in plain sight. Every shadow seemed to watch. Every footstep echoed too loudly. As we entered the tavern, a dim, smoky room filled with the scent of stale ale and whispered secrets, I couldn't help but notice the contrast. The patrons laughed and drank, their faces flushed with drink and false camaraderie, while beneath the surface, alliances were forged and broken with a nod or a glance. Hargrave led us to a darkened corner where a group huddled over maps and coded letters. Their faces were familiar. Some American sympathizers, others British loyalists, all bound by greed and fear rather than loyalty. Lafayette's voice was low but firm. "We know of your plans. This war is over. It's time to choose a side." A man in a fine waistcoat sneered, "The war may be over for you, Marquise, but the game is just beginning. There's profit in chaos and power in fear." Rochambeau stepped forward, eyes blazing. "You gamble with the future of this nation, and you will lose." Suddenly a scuffle erupted. Chairs scraped, fists flew, and the tavern erupted into chaos. I found myself grappling with a burly man whose breath reeked of whiskey and betrayal. The fight was brutal, raw, a clash of desperation and conviction. Amid the turmoil, Abigail appeared at the doorway, her emerald dress torn, but her spirit unbroken. She moved with fierce determination, rallying our allies with a sharp cry, "Hold the line! For freedom!" The tavern became a battleground, but we fought not just with muscle, but with the knowledge that this was a fight for the soul of our new nation. As dawn broke, the conspirators were scattered, some fleeing into the mist, others taken prisoner. But the victory felt hollow. This was merely the first skirmish in a war that would rage in shadows and whispers for years to come. As I caught my breath, Lafayette turned to me, eyes dark with resolve. "Jonathan, this fight isn't over, not by a long shot." And somewhere deep inside I knew he was right. The battle for America's future had entered a new and dangerous phase, one where the weapons were secrets and the stakes were even higher. But as the sun rose over New London, a cold thought gnawed at me. Who among us could truly be trusted? And what price would we pay for freedom's fragile flame? The sun rose over New London, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire, as if the heavens themselves mourned the cost of our hard-won victory. I stood atop a weathered bluff overlooking the town, the salty breeze tugging at my worn coat and tangled hair. The battle for independence was won, or so we thought. But the shadows that clung to this fragile peace whispered a darker truth. Abigail approached quietly, her emerald dress faded but still striking against the rugged landscape. Her eyes, sharp and haunted, met mine with a mixture of hope and warning. "Jonathan," she said softly, "the war may be over, but the real fight for the soul of this new nation is just beginning." I nodded, the weight of her words settling deep in my chest. The betrayals we'd uncovered, the secret alliances, the shadowy conspiracies lurking beneath the surface, they all pointed to a future more uncertain and perilous than any battlefield. From the distance, the tolling of a church bell echoed, a solemn reminder of lives lost and sacrifices made. The British surrender at Yorktown had marked the birth of a nation, but it had also sown seeds of discord that would sprout in unexpected ways. As I turned away from the bluff, my gaze caught a figure standing in the mist, cloaked, watching, waiting. A chill ran down my spine. Was it friend or foe? Ally or traitor? The question lingered like a phantom, unanswered and unsettling. Behind me, Abigail's voice broke the silence. "We must be ready for whatever comes next, because freedom is never free." And with that, the horizon swallowed the mysterious figure, leaving me alone with the rising sun and the weight of an uncertain future. The story of Yorktown was over, but the story of America, our story, was just beginning. And somewhere in the shadows, a new battle was already taking shape. The question was, who would stand strong when the next storm came?